can't just think of tech as mobile phones and social media. Tech goes back to the Greek term for a way of doing things. Techne was a craft. Shipbuilding was techne, even homekeeping. And the Greeks understood that there were better and worse ways of doing these things. And so when I think about the issue with trade, is what I want to say is that it points to the indictment against our education system, which has not made progress in over a generation. We have a generation of people who have not been educated in knowing how to obtain skills.
Join the best in the movement. It's Conservative Conversations with ISI, educating for liberty since 1953. Welcome back. You're listening to Conservative Conversations with Marlo, Johnny, and Nate.
Today, Michael Gibson, a co-founder and general partner at the 1517 Fund, is joining us to discuss alternative education, technology, credentialism, and the book he's working on about the paper belt, which seems to explore all of these subjects. Thanks for joining us, Michael.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Before we get started with our interview, I'd like to thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations with ISI. This podcast is a production of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, where our mission is to educate for liberty. If you'd like to help us in pursuing that mission, please rate and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts to help us reach more listeners like yourself. We also want to invite ISI alumni, faculty, and supporters to attend our second inaugural homecoming weekend featuring Victor Davis Hanson, Ross Douthit, Michael Gibson, and many others, which will take place at ISI's beautiful campus in Wilmington, Delaware on May 13th through the 14th. You're welcome to register at our website, where we are also offering a discounted rate for ISI students and alumni under the age of 30. So, Michael, can you start by telling us about 1517 Fund, which I know I'm familiar with, but how you came to found it alongside your co-founder, and how your venture capital fund is trying to dispel the paper illusion that you associate with a college diploma?
Yeah, sure. That's a complex question, but one thing I'll say is that there are lots of problems with higher education. We could talk about just how expensive it is. How much students are going into debt. We could get into, the radicalized campus and how that has destroyed the study of certain subjects. But what we recognized, in 2010, first working for Peter Thiel, and then in 2015 when we launched our fund, is that we just thought that, universities were holding students back, that universities were, in a sense, trapping people and not letting them explore new ideas with as much freedom as they might have outside of school. So in that, to that point, Peter started a grant program to help, liberate people's imaginations, to give them the time to work on things. And from 2010 to 2015, Danielle Strackman, my co-founder at 1517, and I, we helped Peter start that program. We co-ran the program for 5 years, and we just saw extraordinary things come out of it. One of them, probably the most famous, is Vitalik Buterin was one of our grantees, and we helped him launch Ethereum in 2013. So based on that, we saw an investment thesis there that, our theory about imagination and ingenuity being trapped on campus, we think it's not only true, but also profitable. So we started a fund in 2015.
One of the criteria for the applicants to your fund, I think, is that not only are they not enrolled in school, but they're also under the age of 19, which is, when I was 18 or 19, I, didn't really know anything. And these guys are applying for, I think, $100,000 grants. So I'm curious, what's like the profile of the average person who's actually applying, has their life together enough to apply at the age of 18 or 19 to the fund, and then the people who are actually getting let in? I assume these are pretty exceptional young men and women for the most part.
Yeah, so just to clarify some things, when we started the Thiel Fellowship in 2010, that was the requirement. You had to be 19 or under to apply, and you had to be not enrolled in school. When we started the fund, we just dropped the age requirement. We just wanted to focus on the credential. So we make investments in people who don't have degrees, but we've also made it, that could be someone who's 25 or 30. The fellowship over time did evolve to where they started accepting applications from people who were, I believe, 22 and under. The thinking there was that, when we first started the program, Peter was really concerned about the level of debt that students were accumulating. If you you go to a school and tuition $70,000 a year, what happened, and you're taking loans out to pay for it, when you graduate, oftentimes those people take safe but rewarding career choices. They decide to become management consultants or investment bankers instead of pursuing some project that they're passionate about. So when we started the fellowship, 19 was deemed to be a year. We didn't want people who had so much debt that they had to work to pay it off. I think another thing that stood out was that Peter he was the first investor in Facebook, and his experience with Mark Zuckerberg, I think, led him to think about this age range, because when Zuckerberg first pitched Peter, he was 20 years old, and he was 19, I believe, when he first started Facebook at Harvard. So that was sort of the thinking. Maybe more directly to your question is this idea that so we are looking for exceptional people, and it's not just in terms of let's say their brain power or technical know-how. It's like the type of person who can start a company at a very young age and who has the smarts but also the social skills to do it. It's a very vanishingly small Venn diagram overlap. But on the other hand, we, like by analogy, you see this in sports. If you look at LeBron James, when he started in the NBA, I think he was 19 or 20. Just one look at the guy, you can tell he is very different from the average 20-year-old. So you might say that we are indeed looking for similar types of people. It's just like instead of being, very tall and strong and fast, they tend to be very curious, intelligent and crafty and all sorts of, and they have all these other characteristics that we tend to look for.
Michael, I'm wondering if you could expand, a little bit further on your talent identification process, because a lot of what we do at ISI, it's part, exposing young, bright, ambitious students to the great books, to ideas that really aren't talked about or discussed in the classroom. But, ISI at the same time, we're a organization with limited resources. And so we really focus our attention on identifying the best individuals and then connecting them with our community, our network, really investing in their future careers. So I'm wondering if there are any kind of lessons from your talent ID process that might be helpful for us to keep in mind at ISI as we work with college students.
Yeah, we have a set of characteristics that we look for. Some of them are pretty straightforward. Of course, we mentioned you got to have the brain power to build what you say you're going to build. But some of them are actually, we look through the literature and psychology and personality types, and some of them don't really fit in there. And actually, they originate in the great books and the study of literature, which is kind of fascinating to me. So I've mentioned Peter Thiel a few times. One of his mentors when he went to Stanford was a French literary theorist who also became something of a anthropologist and theologian named René Girard. And Girard studied social dynamics and how that relates to the madness of crowds, and in particular, how crowds pick scapegoats to sacrifice. Very obscure topic. But Girard is interesting because he not only looked at the anthropological record, but he also dives into works of literature. And what he found in examining all these mythologies where crowds picked scapegoats and sacrificed them was he focused on the characteristics of the type of person who was chosen to be the scapegoat. And so, for instance, in Oedipus, Oedipus is both an insider and an outsider. He seems to be foreign, but is also part of the community, and he is the source of the plague that is destroying Thebes. So for Girard, he saw that the scapegoat is often someone who unites extreme opposites, someone like Oedipus, who is an insider and an outsider. In the words of David Byrne from the Talking Heads, these types of people tend to be strange, but not a stranger. And one of the interesting things to me is that Peter Thiel used this pattern as a way to make hires in his companies and as a way to evaluate founders of companies. And we've sort of carried on that tradition where we're looking for this unity of opposites in people. For instance, you may have heard, and it's true, that a lot of first generation immigrants become entrepreneurs. And one of the reasons I think that's the case is this Girardian view where they are at once part of the community, but they're also different because they're new to it. And there's something about that we find that lends itself to creativity and the generation of new ideas. I mean, it could be the case that it's just like by living in two domains, you tend to see things a little bit differently, or you combine different things. But maybe it speaks to just like this impulse within people who are able to unite opposites, that it leads to something new. That's pretty far out there, but I think since you mentioned the great books, I think it's fascinating that they can still be used for other things than, I don't know, writing essays in college. It's we return to these things to think about the nature of creativity as well.
Well, and it gets to something else that I wanted to ask you about, Mike, which is just obviously a big part of Thiel's project and what you guys are doing overall is trying to disrupt an industry and in many ways a country and even a civilization which has grown stagnant and out of new ideas and doesn't innovate in the same way. Obviously, we're having this discussion. The backdrop to the discussion this week is what's happening at Twitter. And there are some debates, particularly in our sort of political circles, about how much a ostensible disruptor like Elon Musk can come in and actually change a company that in many ways has become symptomatic of the larger issues with Silicon Valley and with tech, and even with sort of America in general. So I'm curious what you think about that, and if you're optimistic about the potential for reform in some of these old legacy Silicon Valley companies, or if you really think disruption and outsiders coming in and sort of taking over is the only way to sort of solve the issues that have taken root in that industry.
Yeah, interesting. A lot there. I think with Musk taking over Twitter, we're going to have to see how the plan unfolds. But I do think there's a lot of potential for change there in a positive direction. In particular, I think as a public company with lots of different shareholders, Twitter had to focus on its revenue. And Mark Andreessen, the creator of Netscape way back in the 90s, he said the original sin of the internet starting in 1995 was that it was going to depend upon this advertising model. And from that business model that you were going to give away things for free and then sell advertising, it created a lot of the issues that we see today with these big tech companies, in particular Twitter, Facebook, and Google, because they depend so much upon ads for sales. Now, why is that an issue? Well, because they're selling ads, they're harnessing all their computation to figure out how to sell ads more effectively, or to drive users to do things like such as get addicted to the product and so on, so they can sell more ads. So if Elon is able to take Twitter private and make it a private company, that means he no longer has to have quarterly calls to discuss the increase or decrease in revenue from ad sales. In fact, he can stop selling ads completely. And if that changes if that business model changes in Twitter, then I think we can see just a different platform emerge. It may, for instance, they may not be as incentivized to get people to stare at the screen for longer and to sell ads more frequently and so on. So I don't know, that is like in the depths on the business model, but more to the point is that, Musk seems to be a believer in free speech. And if he reinstates Trump on there, if some of the COVID skeptics, anyone on there starts posting stuff, I think it could turn into a Wild West, which could be pretty fun to see.
Michael, I know so we're on the subject of kind of stagnation right now. And obviously Tyler Cowen kind of had this idea of the great stagnation, which he uses to refer more to economic stagnation. But I think we're also to some degree seeing that on the technological and cultural fronts. So kind of these plateaus in American, tech and culture, in that we, even when we were watching the Super Bowl, my husband noted it was all musicians during the what's it called? Not the intermission.
The halftime show.
Yeah, the halftime show.
You're clearly a Super Bowl fan.
Yeah, I know. I clearly am very familiar with American sports. But it was all musicians from the millennials and Gen Gen Xers would be very familiar with. There wasn't really anything new being shown during that time. So, and even the commercials themselves were kind of indicative of that as well during the Super Bowl. So I'm curious what your thoughts are, as an investor in some of these, renegades and other against the grain scientists and young people who are kind of bucking the default setting, I guess, for a lot of American 18-year-olds who just go off to college. Do you see kind of a stagnation, generally speaking? How does that play into kind of your philosophy at 1517 too?
Yeah, sure. So, maybe thinking about this in four parts. The first part would be that is this idea of progress. And I think it's fair to say that a lot of the good things in life, in fact, most of them come from gains in knowledge or wisdom. The rise in our standard of living, the level of our wealth, our dazzling cities, clear blue skies, even the strength and happiness of the family, I would say depends in large part upon gains in knowledge. And that could be in science, tech, and even philosophy. I mean, we can argue if we can make progress in philosophy. I think we can. But that's the first part, that a lot of these good things in life depend upon progress. The next part would be to say that we have not been made, that the rate of progress has declined quite substantially since about the early 1970s. That's the Thiel stagnation thesis, and Tyler Cowen expanded on it in his book, The Great Stagnation. And you can even check out a book called The Rise and Fall of American Growth by Robert Gordon. Something happened in America in 1971 or thereabouts. Something ripped the hull, and now the cabins are filling with water, and the boat is listing to port. And what are the signs of this? So we could go, outside of, what's interesting is, like, outside of computers and communication technologies, you could go industry by industry. And it does indeed appear to be the case that progress is not increasing at the rate that it formerly was, say, starting from like the end of the Civil War to 1971. So, like my mom was raised by her grandmother, who was born in 1890 or thereabouts. She was born in a world without radio, without cars, without planes, without skyscrapers, without radio, television. She died in 1980. So she lived to see the invention of all those things and see someone land on the moon. Alan Shepard hit a golf ball on the moon in 1973. So that's a lot of change that occurred over her life. But if I think of my own life, I was born in the 70s. I mean, I've seen the advent and spread of the internet and mobile telephones. But if you look at energy creation, okay, we are still dependent upon the same sources of energy that we used to be in the past. We have not been making progress in the creation of energy. And that's not even to speak of clean energy. So it's like we could talk about nuclear fusion, we're not making progress. We could talk about healthcare. So again, from 1900 to about 1980, if you look at the increase in the average life expectancy of US citizens, it went from something like 45 to 72. That's a dramatic increase, and that was driven by major discoveries like penicillin, but also other things you don't really think about, such as sanitation. From 1980 to the present, life expectancy has only gone up about 3.5 years. And with the last 5 years, with the opioid epidemic and with COVID, life expectancy has actually gone down. So again, that shows that we're not making progress. And I could keep going on. Education, we're spending 3 to 4 times as much per student, and that counts K through 12, universities. And I think we can all agree that our education is not 3 times better than it used to be. I just saw a stat, something like a quarter of all Californians over the age of 15 are illiterate. I think that's a major indictment of our education system. So, all right, yeah, so we're not making progress. The third thing is to say that, to go to education is like education is a case in point of this stagnation. And the next step, number 4, would be to say, okay, how do we break out of this? What can we change in the education system from K through 12 to the university to make sure that people are learning, that they're getting prepared for their life and careers, and that they can make contributions to any of these fields to help bring civilization to the next level, to turn this stagnation around. So maybe that was long-winded, but that's sort of that's like the nested layers of how we see what we do. There's this overarching stagnation. Education's a part of it. And we see 1517 as something that's very different, that's trying to push against it.
Mike, when it comes to, the sort of end of progress, to use, I guess, a dramatic term, what do you think? This is a conservative podcast. It's mostly listened to by conservatives. What do you think the implications are of that pretty drastic shift in the sort of direction of American life for the way that the right thinks about issues like tech, but also the broader political issues that you're talking about? I mean, if you look at someone like Ronald Reagan, for example, who was up until pretty recently the sort of preeminent figure on the American right, he had a sort of progressive way of talking about conservatism. It was sunny, forward-looking, confident in sort of innovation, et cetera, et cetera. And obviously, if you look at the shift on the right in recent years, it's a very, very different emphasis now. And there's a lot more pessimism, a lot more anger, a lot more feeling that something has gone horribly wrong in the country, which I think reflects a lot of what you're talking about. So it's obviously a pretty broad question, but I'm curious if you think, how conservatives should be responding to / thinking about these issues, as particularly in tech, as that's something you're pretty close to, obviously.
Maybe it would have to get down into the particulars of policy. I think one area where, let's say, conservatives and more libertarian-minded people have diverged over the last 30 years is probably, the first thing I would say is free trade. So, standard libertarian view is that, all trade is good, exchange to mutual advantage from two different sides is always beneficial. But conservatives have always, had a skeptical eye on some issues in trade. And in particular, over the last 30 years, or maybe 20 years, has been, the trade situation with China. So I think there's been a sharp divergence between conservatives and libertarians on that. And rightfully so, because I think, conservatives have seen that the family, you see that, as we outsourced our manufacturing to places like China, it hollowed out a lot of regions in America, especially the Rust Belt, the Appalachian area, and some of those families in those towns were just destroyed because without any jobs or without any industries, they had no way of supporting themselves. I mean, that's the standard story. And then the Rust Belt just became the epicenter of the opioid epidemic. We had seen an increase in the deaths of despair. So I think the conservative case against free trade there is actually quite compelling, which I'll get into more. But the next thing where I think conservatives and maybe libertarians have parted ways is related directly to tech, in the sense that it's like tech has come to mean really just the giant tech companies that exist, and in particular Facebook, Google, Apple, to some degree, Amazon. And as the universities drifted to the left, those companies have also drifted to the left now in recent years. And platforms like Twitter and Facebook and YouTube have started censoring conservative viewpoints. They've been imposing their left-wing progressive views. And so I think naturally conservatives are suspicious of this power. And they're, outside of Elon Musk overtaking Twitter over, it doesn't seem to be like there are ways around it. So conservative thinkers have begun to examine the antitrust case against some of these companies. So I think those are the two big areas where maybe libertarians are more like, okay, well, these companies are doing bad things, but maybe, that we can't trust the regulators to regulate them. They're only going to make it worse. When it comes to progress, it's like, I don't think conservatives, if you take the first issue I mentioned, this idea of trade with China hollowing out the Rust Belt, and what did we get in return? Now we have a new Cold War with a hostile superpower. I think part of the issue relates to the area, like we can't just think of tech as mobile phones and social media. Tech goes back to the Greek term for a way of doing things. Techne was a craft. Shipbuilding was techne, even homekeeping. And the Greeks understood that there were better and worse ways of doing these things. And so when I think about the issue with trade, is what I want to say is that it points to the indictment against our education system, which has not made progress in over a generation. We have a generation of people who have not been educated in knowing how to obtain skills, in having skills, in knowing how to take care of their lives. And so I think what happens naturally in a dynamic economy is that as jobs are destroyed, new jobs are created. And sometimes it takes some new skill. It takes a new level of learning to obtain the skills to get those new jobs. But what that points to me is like, we don't have a system that does that. So to me, that situation is more an indictment of our education system necessarily than the idea of trade itself. So I think conservatives should really get upset about the stagnation in education. I can't believe that we've stomached a century of socialist education and we've lived with its results and people aren't upset. I think we should be angry that the state does impose its ideology on our children. And so I think the conservative case for progress in education is actually quite strong for those reasons.
Michael, I'm curious, kind of in two separate kind of tracks of questions. One has to do with, education producing the elite class that we have today. The second is more kind of strategically thinking about the future that we might hope to sort of build together as Americans. On that second point, one of my friends on Twitter, had pointed out that with Elon purchasing Twitter, that it takes elites to beat elites, right? That you're always going to have elites. He was citing, Burnham's book, The Machiavellians, and while some conservatives or post-liberals are complaining about the fact that a billionaire, period, is controlling a platform like Twitter that should, in their view, be a public good. This person was basically saying, no, you're always going to have elites. The challenge is really educating them and, getting them to defend the type of American values of a free society that we want, instead of just sort of indoctrinating everyone with progressive values. So I'm curious if you could talk a little bit on, is the goal really to maybe capture or raise up a new set of elites to take over these institutions? Or is there perhaps a more kind of democratized approach that we could look at? And then second, on the education front, these Ivy League schools and other universities really are kind of the pipeline that are credentialing our elite class today. I'm sort of wondering, if you were education czar, how would you go about dismantling this infrastructure?
The dissolution of the monasteries was I guess when Henry VIII decided to make England Protestant, he also decided to shut down all the Catholic monasteries in England. So maybe I have some friends who have suggested this is what we need to do to Harvard. We need to have troops raid the campus and shut it down. Maybe that's a little extreme.
This is not the official ISI podcast position, just to put that out there institutionally. Maybe on a higher level, I think as a country, we've become obsessed with inputs and haven't been paying attention to outputs. And this ties into even the way we use words like elite or genius. Like, genius used to mean, something wonderful that manifested itself in a creative work. And nowadays it just means someone who has, scored high on a test, has a certain IQ, which is weird to me. It's like, when I think of a genius, I want to think of Michelangelo because he, produced frescoes and sculptures. I don't want to think about Marilyn von Sant. I think she's I think I'm saying her name correctly. Apparently she has the highest recorded IQ. But what does she do? She writes like an advice column for a newspaper supplement. Like, to me, Michelangelo's a genius. I'm not so sure about her. And what that speaks to is like, somehow this test is just like an input. It's supposed to be a predictor of someone's ability to do certain things. And likewise with the elite. So it's like people who accumulate credentials, maybe they go to the top schools and so on. They get jobs in the administrative state. In one sense, they are elite because they're near the top of a hierarchy of one sort. But that, to me, is just the input. What we should be looking at is the output. Is like, what is the country we live in? Are families happy? Are they well off? Are we making progress? And if we go back to the stagnation story,
Well, the answer is no. So to me, it's just like this bunk elite. It's like, yeah, they're elite in name, but they're not elite in what they actually produce. So I do think we have to, question our assumptions about, who is elite and who isn't. Now, if you frame it in terms of power, yes, I think the power structures of America are certainly occupied by people who are who come out of these universities, who have these types of careers and so on. But I think the answer is something which you alluded to earlier on in your question, which is that I think we need competing institutions. I think we need checks and balances. I think individual agency matters. I think it is a stroke of heroism to some degree that Elon Musk is willing to spend that much money in order to counter this movement against free speech. So yeah, you're never gonna. I haven't read Burnham. I know a lot of people who have, but going back to Pareto, this idea that the 80-20 rule, that there are always going to be a lot of things are determined by 20% of the whole. I think that's going to hold for just about any category. I think the key is to focus on, is this a real elite, or is it appearance or reality? And one of the ways to make that division is to make sure that people are competing and that there are checks and balances on these things.
On the subject of elite centers of power, you're working on a book focused entirely on what you call the paper belt. And we're hoping to hear a little bit more about that during Homecoming, where you'll be on a panel discussing credentialism and class, and hopefully more about your book. But can you tell us a little bit more about what you mean by the paper belt, and specifically the geographic region that it refers to?
Yeah, the paper belt was this term a buddy of mine, Balaji Srinivasan, and we used to have these late night bull sessions where we'd be in a 24-hour Starbucks arguing over the future, like we were, I don't know, poets in some Paris cafe. And he came up with this term. So I mentioned the Rust Belt that has come to, designate this area in the Midwest that was hollowed out. And so we were throwing out this hypothesis that in the next, 10, 15 years, the region that was going to face the greatest competitive pressure was what we were deemed the paper belt. And this was the area that stretches from Washington, D.C. to Boston, the I-95 Acela corridor. And the reason we used paper belt was just because it seemed like a lot of the products of that region are made on paper. So in Washington, D.C., the government prints money on paper. They make laws on paper, regulations on paper, and so on. In Delaware, people incorporate on paper. In New York, the media, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and so on, magazines are printed on paper, advertising on paper. And then in Boston, Harvard, and MIT are sort of the pinnacle of the university system, and they're printing diplomas on paper. So yeah, in a flight of radicalism, I suggested that the title of my book is Paper Belt on Fire. In one sense, I think it's like twofold. One, it's like to the extent that these institutions are corrupt and not serving the purposes, their stated mission, I think we need to find alternatives. So in that sense, I sometimes say I want to set the paper belt on fire, but I also think it's on fire because I think there's a social crisis at hand, and a large part of it is this institutional failure. We've talked about universities and how they're not living up to their mission. But we could go through the alphabet soup of the regulatory agencies and the administrative state, the CDC, and the FDA, for one, during COVID. I mean, at the beginning, it's just the whiplash on mixed messaging or lying has just been so extreme that a lot of people have lost trust in those institutions. And I think that's a good example. So for me, I think we are, if you go up that corridor on the East Coast, you're going to we could examine each one of those institutions. And I think each and every single one of them is failing to some degree. I think it's an issue of their reliability and their untrustworthiness. And my book is meant to address that, in part. A lot of it is about education, but it does touch on things like the media and the government.
Could you talk a little bit more just about, I think a lot of our listeners won't be as familiar with the sort of personal story of your relationship to college and how much it informed what you talk about in your book. I assume that experience personally was pretty integral to the book you're writing and the subject you're talking about.
What's that? It's like we're having a discussion about politics and policy and so on, and my book is about that. But I wanted to tell a story from the first person perspective. I don't know if I'm successful in that. That's going to be up to the readers to decide. I hope I tell an interesting story, but yeah, I've seen the inner temple in universities, and I worked hard to get there. I was working towards a PhD in philosophy, and I saw it was empty. I was not impressed with the academic world, and I didn't, I thought I just wanted to write at the time, so I dropped out of my PhD program. I studied philosophy, ancient and moral philosophy, and I realized I just wanted to write, so I dropped out and I became a writer at Technology Review. This is because I was dating someone who lived in Cambridge, and so it was a baptism by fire into science and tech. I can read Latin and Greek. I didn't know much. I hadn't investigated quantum mechanics, so that was a difficult job. But it was a big shift for me. And then from there, it's like through a series of unlikely events. That's how I met Peter Thiel. I was freelancing at the time. I had helped out a nonprofit that he backed called the Seasteading Institute. This is this wild idea to create floating platforms and villages on the ocean where people could experiment with new forms of governance. And there was an opening at his hedge fund they said they needed a researcher. I didn't want to work in finance, but Peter was such an interesting guy that I said yes. I interviewed, and then I ended up in an interview with him, and we just talked about René Girard, Emile Durkheim, and then he, and then he said he was teaching a class at Stanford on philosophy and technology, and he asked me if I'd help him out. So I said yes. And then, I showed up to work the first day and we started the fellowship. So it's like that is a series of unlikely events. But the common thread through it all is like I did think I was going to become a professor. I was very jaded by that experience. And then all through it, I've always been concerned about, advancing, people's freedom in a sense, not to be trapped by things. And maybe that's been expressed in different ways. And when we decided to start the fellowship, it really felt like, okay, this was a true expression of some of the things I felt having almost become a professor.
Michael, I'm wondering if you could talk about some of conservatives' blind spots when it comes to the tech industry more broadly. I know you had mentioned earlier, that big tech, quote unquote, is actually a lot more complicated, complex than people often get credit for. And I sometimes I think of the label big tech as a little similar to the label critical race theory. And, with CRT, for example, Chris Rufo had said, and I think politically there's actually something to this, but he wants your ordinary person every time they see diversity, equity, inclusion to just immediately slap the label, CRT on it, and you could probably parse apart whether is everything technically CRT, probably not, but it certainly flows from the worldview of CRT. I think similarly with big tech, the label is a way that something you can slap on kind of the FANG companies and basically say, look, they're not patriotic. They're more loyal to China than they are America, whatever. You go down the list of criticisms you could level at them. Some of it, I think it was politically advantageous, but then there's the other aspect of it. Is it entirely true? There's more complexity, more nuance to it. So maybe you could talk a little bit about, from your view, what are conservatives' blind spots when it comes to thinking about the tech industry?
I think it's just this narrowing focus in thinking about tech is only what apps we have on our phone and the improvements in our laptops. I think if we broaden the idea of technology and science and progress to include areas like healthcare, education, energy creation, transportation, I think we would do well to not obsess over Facebook so much and worry about those other areas more. So that's like the overarching thing. If it's a specific technology, I would say that's underrated among conservatives. Maybe it's Bitcoin and the blockchain. And what's going on there? I guess I have to think about it. But it's something like like I would say some institutions have been around for so long that we've ceased to see how abnormal they are. And in the case of Bitcoin, that would be the Federal Reserve and fiat money. And I think Volcker, the head of the Federal Reserve in 1980, famously fought inflation. And since 1980 to the financial crisis, there was a relatively calm area where it seemed like, the heads of the Federal Reserve were competent people. But now, again, with the financial crisis, and now fast forward to today, with inflation spiraling out of control, I think their competence is coming into question yet again. So to understand Bitcoin and what it does and how it works, I think it would serve conservatives well to look into that, because it is an alternative to this corrupt institution. It's meant to be a check on it, a competitor to it. And so if what are conservatives conserving? Is it just something that's been around for a long time? I think there has to be some way to examine some of these things. And the challenge is to say, can we replace it? Conservatives are, I guess, skeptical of replacing old things, old traditions, and by and large, they're right. The wisdom of generations is embodied in some of these institutions, and in that sense, they're smarter than any one of us can ever be. But don't let that fool you into thinking that some of these institutions might not be trustworthy anymore.
On that note, Michael, before we wrap up, I want to ask you, and you may not even identify, strictly as a conservative. I'm wondering, what would you, and this is what we ask all of our guests, what would you define conservatism as?
I sort of I have been calling myself lately a conservative anarchist as one of these examples of polarities in tension. The anarchist in me wants to push against the sclerotic status quo, wants to empower individuals to pursue, the life that they choose to pursue. But the conservative in me is always yearning for, this spiritual quest for higher things, the search for the eternal truths, and those aren't going away. So to me, conservatism is mainly about the search for those eternal truths and trying to live by them. And maybe less than, this sort of Burkean argument about the accumulated wisdom. I think that is a powerful one, and certainly we should be careful about what we decide to remove. Like, I don't know if you've heard of Chesterton's fence, but this idea that if we just find a fence in a field, we shouldn't remove it until we really understand why it's there. I think that's important. But to me, conservatism really is about, those eternal truths that they do exist, for one thing, and that they're worth fighting for, worth searching for, and so on.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Michael. If people are interested in seeing more of your work or following you in 1517, where can they find you?
Okay, yeah, I do have you guys mentioned my book that's coming out on October 25th, Paper Belt on Fire, published by Encounter. I'm excited about that. It touches on a lot of these things we've talked about. You can find me. I joined Twitter early, and I thought it was a platform for haikus, so I signed up with the name @WilliamBlake. You can find me as @WilliamBlake the poet on Twitter. I've just kept the handle over the years. And then if you're interested in what we do at 1517 Fund, check us out, 1517fund.com. We have a contact form. You can reach us there. We're very accessible, even if you're not working on tech, because we're interested in ideas too.
Great. Thanks again for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations with ISI. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please feel free to head over to isi.org/resources to see all that we offer our members, including the Intercollegiate Review, select Modern Age articles, ISI books, and of course, this podcast. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to rate and review, and we will see you next time on Conservative Conversations with ISI.